And but there's been a lot of migration stories already in Philippine cinema. And for example, the America that you've seen, I argue, is one of the earliest ones, but there are much earlier ones that may not be properly called diasporic films, but the themes touch on that pretty well. But this one by Olivia Lamasan called Milan is also an exemplar of this particular kind of cinema, of people who live in Italy and how they manage the day-to-day, very quotidian, mundane things that they do while in a foreign place. By the way, I showed this to my class when I was still in the United States, and I showed them as an example of it. They didn't like it at all because of there were some scenes of running with music and all that. And I said, you're not the audience for this. This is for Filipinos and for diasporic Filipinos who wanted this kind of, for lack of a better term, a kind of entertainment, right? So that they could live out certain fantasies. It's not really for you, but for you to study even more. So I thought it was hilarious. And then the Bagong Bayani that was first introduced to us meant that it's really more remittances, which is the #1 source of income for the Philippines. When I was a student here, I remember that our teacher in economics told us that it used to be how much we produce, right, in terms of gross national income. And later on, he did say something that it's really remittances. These are money sent by your relatives abroad here in the Philippines that increases the gross national income of the country. So you see there is a kind of symbiotic relationship existing between the Bagong Bayani ideology of making you go out to send money back home and being called a Bagong Bayani or a new hero. For many of you who have traveled abroad, you notice when you come back in the airport, there's always this particular lane devoted to OFW, which, symbolically it does mean something, even if the lines do not necessarily move faster than the others, but it's just like a recognition that OFWs are given their own lanes rather than devoted to foreigners, right? And it's always gendered. How it shifted into a gendered kind of migration through the years was because in the 70s, it's mostly men who went to the South and Southwest, basically Middle East. I don't want to call it Middle East because it reinforces the Eurocentric vision, but the idea of where people work there to be gainfully employed in oil companies. And then it shifted even more to more women going there to become domestic helpers, nurses, allied medicine thing. And that picture of this woman wearing scrubs featured in the New York Times magazine pretty much captures it. Rolando Tolentino, who spoke yesterday, spoke about this in one of his articles called The Vaginal Economies in reference to the highly gendered labor that has shifted somehow between the Marcos and the Aquino administration. And I'm forgetting the name of this documentary at the moment, but there's this wonderful documentary about Filipino domestic helpers who go abroad to take care of the kids of other families, while their own kids in the Philippines are being taken care of by relatives. So it's kind of very ironic that they're taking care of other people's children so they could gain money while their own kids are being raised in the absence of a parental presence. So remittances. So to move on to how is this captured cinematically, we have images such as this, right? That one is Perfume Nightmare by Kidlat Tahimik. Well, you probably would say, how is that diasporic? Well, he did go to Germany, right? His character went there. He was the president of an organization, and later on, it's his encounter with super modernity, right? Later on, Frederick Jameson would call him the art naif, because Frederick Jameson was pretty much just trying to find an example to explain late capitalism. But pretty much, Kidlat Tahimik himself went there. This was in 1977. Batang West Side by Lav Diaz, 2001. And Bagong Bayani by Ticoy Aguilos are examples of different phases of how we, our compatriots, Filipinos, have been abroad to work. But really, the premise of my talk is geared towards people who also go there, but a little bit more about the tension between the homeland and the exile. But just some quick theories so that I won't have to bore you so much. But I feel like Edward Said has mentioned this in his Reflections on Exile, a book that he he wrote about the fact that this very, very difficult, painful, crippling loneliness, that relates to the unhealable rift between a person goes through when he or she is in another area. And of course, Jonas Mekas, who recently passed away, just like Nick Del Campo, who I look up to in experimental cinema, one of the stalwarts of experimental cinema, has also mentioned in his film called Lost, Lost, Lost. In fact, this is it. This is from his film Lost, Lost, Lost. But I'm going to argue that. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just go back to it a little bit. My own theory of the unhomeness. It's not like I coined this word. It's just like something I wanted to make happen, but it hasn't gained traction. It's unheimlich by Sigmund Freud, which basically is about the uncanny, and it's. Just move on to the next one because it has more information. And it's about the idea, could you occupy two spaces at the same time? Could you also not occupy more than one space at the same time? So that pretty much is the tension between that. I have a colleague who before, when she wanted to work abroad for good, asked me a question. She said, Joseph, so what do you think I should do? Do I accept a job in X country? Because my commitment is really in the Philippines. And I remember telling her, but the heart should be large enough to accommodate more than one world. So you should totally go. So she did, and I hope she's happy. And then there's also this idea of in-betweenness, which some scholars, Omi Baba, Doreen Massey, has talked about, that you're neither here or there. By the way, when I wrote the word in-betweenness, it's actually one word, but the nature of this premise is that it separates it, but I wanted it to be one word. It's also a semantic war I had against with the Microsoft. And also, Unhomed Geographies by Ira Turgov and Doreen Mass has been explored. And then there's this Iranian scholar with the name of Hamid Nafitsi, who basically said cinemas that are accented, should just be just as good in terms of being considered cinema. What's interesting though, I forget about this, so I may have to ask my colleagues and some of you, but recently in the Academy Awards, there used to be a category called Best Foreign Language Film, and now they changed it to something else, and I'm forgetting the name of the moment. Only this year, they will change it into another name. I guess films not in the English language, probably, but it's interesting how they became the default, right? Or as what Patrick said earlier, in terms of who really decides, what vision is the cinema of, say, Mindanao or something, what kinds of films are being marketed worldwide. So there. Now let's move on to the films themselves. Like I said, I'm going to look at Cavite and Rigodon, which Sari and Keith did, and Cavite by Ian and Neil de la Liana. And I'm just going to focus first on Rigodon. This is just a quick one, but to show you this. These are Filipinos who were in New York City and who were dealing with the aftermath of 9/11. Amado is an aging boxer, probably a classical OFW, a documented worker, right? So, and then Salome, played by Jinjin Gutierrez, is a mail order bride, and she desires a child with blue eyes. And do not underestimate that kind of thinking, because when you read books such as Toni Morrison's, actually they refer to people who are people of color when they were growing up with no other role model to wish for the blue eyes, which means the dominant ideology. And in the case of Salome, she performs all these kinds of activities and rituals, like wearing this Filipino dress, doing certain kinds of things, to remind her of home. So you pretty much know that the tension between home and exile has been very difficult, or at least very significant for her. And then there's Dante, played by Joe Torre, who represents the poet. He helps the undocumented workers in New York, and he's kind of like a Mater Dolorosa in some point, like a panopticon that sees everything, And what's interesting about their stories was that they are pretty much living out their own lives in a foreign land, but they are longing for an area, for a place that's not there at the moment, whether in their hearts, whether it's an imagined landscape. And here's where I'm going to position these three ideas. Sorry if it's a little bit wordy, but for example, what about your memory? How do you do that? When Doy Del Mundo, who was one of the speakers earlier this morning, told me that when I was gathering data, said you need to go to the States and also interview Filipino filmmakers for your project in order to gain a national perspective. It's odd that you have to go out of the national space in order to look at it, this thing. So one of the filmmakers I actually interviewed before said something like this. He was in the United States for about 24 years, and he told me that when he did a film, he idealizes because he hasn't been back. So the Philippines that he's trying to create in his film is not like the Philippines that I've seen when I was still here. You know, for example, there are probably more Mormons, or probably more Koreans, or more people in the rural area has malls now. So even the whole idea of the urban and the rural can be extended to be a periphery, urban or rural. So, and then there's this idea of how are you always being haunted by that idealization. Sophia Siddique from Singapore came up with this topic, this concept called spectral tropicality. Spectral, you know, ghost-like, you know, tropicality, wherein it kind of haunts you, you know, wherever you are, whether you are in a temperate region or not. And then there's also this idea of Salome, right? Why do you perform those kinds of things in private? You know, why do you do that? You know, so there's this inherent idea of why. We don't know. It's very ambiguous. Is she trying to live out a life as a Filipina in a foreign land, desiring a baby with blue eyes but not getting it? You know, so there's this wonderful tension that looks into her own trying to work onto this issue. And then to go back to the home geographies part, could it be, and this is one thing that I would like to argue here, could it be that maybe the whole idea of home is not rooted in a geopolitical space, but something in transit, something in between, something that doesn't just position you in one place, but it's where you go. You know, so some of us, you know, who have lived for some years in other parts of the world, sometimes have that feeling of where do you really stand in all of this. So let me go towards the Cavite part of the story, and this is directed by two filmmakers, a Filipino-American, Ian Gamazon and Neil de la Liana. Originally, the character that was played, by the way, this young man right there in the picture is Ian Gamazon, the filmmaker. Originally, they wanted a female actress to portray the role of a person going back to the Philippines because her mother and sister were kidnapped. Right? But they couldn't find anyone. And this is purely guerrilla filmmaking. So they said, why don't I just do that? You know, so Ian did. And he has no acting experience, and he did that, which I think added to certain gravitas. By the way, when the movie came out, the New York Times said something like this: in commenting the performance of Ian Gamazon as an actor in the movie, one need not dwell on it because clearly he's not an actor. It's really more on the truth that he's trying to bring. So it kind of almost becomes like what Nick said earlier, a kind of documentary in terms of it unfolds, except that there's a kind of narrative that you know, powers this film. Could you be alien and not foreign at the same time? It should be alien and native. I'm sorry about that mistake. But could you be alien and native at the same time? In his case, can he be that? Meaning he cannot be in one place. In the case of him, Adam, his name is Adam, he returns home because of the kidnapping of his sister and mother. The premise of the story is someone calls him on the phone, Abu Sayyaf, according to the narrative of the story. And he was saying, like, you have to go to this place in Cavite to carry this something, and if you fail, we're going to kill your mom and your sister. So that's what happened. And so that's what he did. But then the whole movie was about the travel towards this town of the Philippines. What is interesting about this story was that Ian Gamazon, this is the first time he's been to this area. So the camera that was trained on the everyday things that we see as Filipinos that are ordinary are also very strange to him. But it is so defamiliarizing for him. It's just like, you remember that movie that Sofia Coppola did, Lost in Translation, when Charlotte, you know, the character played by Scarlett Johansson, was moving towards Tokyo. It's like seeing that place for the first time, except that for a native, you've seen that place before, phenomenologically embedded in your mind, right? But to them, it's something new because it's something foreign. So in this case, when he came back here, this is just my own observation, but this movie is not going to help the Philippines with its bid for tourism because of the squalor, the filth, you know, the all kinds of ugliness that is quite exactly what Lino Broca wanted to show when he did all these films that he did during the martial law, as a kind of critic against the city of man that Marcos has wanted to mount. But this is kind of a reverse cultural tourism, more because it, it implicates a lot of people and places into the process, right? And in the case of him, since he is Filipino-American and he wanted to know his roots, even if he doesn't speak Filipino, it's like his reacquaintance to a past that he doesn't even become a part of, So it's a kind of vexing dilemma, if I may call it. And that's why when he returned home, in my opinion, when he returned home, and by the way, most of the shots in the film were him walking behind, because it's really, just kind of almost a handheld camera. What if there's no home in the homeland? That was precisely what was said, right? There's a geographer by the name of Alison Blunt who basically said that home should be seen more as not just a space, but lived experience. But what if lived experience doesn't even exist cinematically? How do you capture that? And this is the part that I think finds parallel to what Nick mentioned earlier about what if they're just images with no words? And that's the part I also like about the kind of cinema I like, is when language fails, emotions and affect, non-representation things are more important because they convey more than just actual words. But in this one, in particular, he was constantly searching. So remember that unheimlich, that the uncanny that Freud said also, being lost, is pretty much in evidence here. Looking for something to make sense of his life, but at the same time, he's really looking for home. He's basically traumatized. So it both legitimizes or authenticates and naturalizes the territorial claims. What we mean by that is that he's here in the Philippines filming it, but at the same time, he's not really belonging to this place. So you wonder whether could home be, as a concept, just one of the cultural narratives, that we say that maybe it doesn't really exist. You can be homeless at home, and those kinds of things. So this is why I'm coming to the last of my discussion. 3 more slides left, but that's why I told you earlier this is not going to be a happy ending for those of you wanting to find a happy thing. But maybe there's no home. That's the idea. The imagined ideal has been violated. You came back. It wasn't the same place that you always wanted to be, right? So the mythic protean homeland that you had in your mind probably doesn't even exist, but just exists here. It's just as good to have imagined landscapes. Remember what the late Agnes Varda said, who said something, if you open up people, you will see landscapes, For example, in the case of Amado from Sari and Kit's film, Ligudon, and Adam played in Cavite, their statelessness. They're being not there and there at the same time. Rooted in an actual place, but not really there. Salome's, trying to cosmopolitanize herself, but in very vernacular terms, right? And Dante's, although you did not really see the film, so I really urge you to see it. Maybe we should really have a screening of that film at some point. But Dante's own resistance, his ambiguous feeling of helping those undocumented Filipinos, at the same time being already part of the United States, that sometimes can be called home. So at the end, the very end of this, we are faced with this question. And by the way, I have to tell you, when this picture came out, it's more like this is pretty much the whole picture of the Lotavos diaspora. Wanted to show you, but for some reason I had technical glitch, and I said, this look wonderful to show because it disrupts the whole idea of when you look at diaspora in this sense, there is what I argue an active form of unbelonging. Notice it's quite the opposite of belonging. I want to belong, but a kind of distancing yourself to the whole area because it doesn't really speak to you anymore. Right? So where is home? I argue that it may not even be the place where you went to that adopted you, but could be somewhere in between. So the in-betweeners is the one I wanted to also focus. I'm sure it may just not run well with others. And then the liminal or the interstitial, meaning the one in between, spaces between homeland and diaspora need to be looked at even more. Now, as I end this particular presentation, since this is more exile and homeland, I urge you to actually watch specific Filipino films. There's one film, although this is not about exile and diaspora, but I wanted I've been watching Filipino films recently and seeing these kinds of tensions. There's Patay na si Jesus. But one film in particular called Pauwi Na really struck me as something very visceral and at the same time truly truly revolutionary in its own way. It's a family that wants to move from the urban to the rural. So notice the trope. Rural is much better than urban. But realizing rural is not as good. In fact, there's even death, that happened. So what does that say, about our own homeness? Where do we go in this particular in this particular scheme of things, right? So yeah, maybe that's something that we can talk about in the open forum. So thank you.